Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Syracuse University Art Museum for our first in-person event for this year's Watson Professorship. Some of you, I think, probably joined us on Zoom yesterday, so happy to see you all here. I'm Kate Hollihan, Curator of Education here at the museum. I know some of you, not all of you, so it's nice to see new faces too. We'll begin our program by acknowledging with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And we are thrilled today to be joined by Rina Banerjee, the 2023 Jeanette K. Watson Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Humanities. Ms. Banerjee was born in Kolkata, India, and lived briefly in the UK before arriving in Queens, New York. Drawing on her multinational background and personal history as an immigrant, she focuses on ethnicity, race, migration, and American diasporic histories in her sculpture, drawings, and video art. Several examples of Ms. Banerjee's dynamic work are on view here as part of the exhibition Take Me to the Palace of Love, on view through May 14th. The Watson Professorship is presented by the Syracuse University Humanities Center in partnership with many co-sponsors, including, of course, the museum. In conversation with Ms. Banerjee this afternoon is Timur Hammond, Assistant Professor of Geography and the Environment in the Maxwell School here at Syracuse. Trained as an urban and cultural geographer, Hammond's research draws on ethnographic methods to explore the intersection between urban experience and religious belief in 20th century Turkey. Also in conversation with us is Lawrence Chua, Associate Professor in the School of Architecture. Chua is a historian of the global modern built environment with an emphasis on the trans-regional histories of Asian architecture and urban cultures. His current research project examines the ways fragments of medieval and early modern polities in Southeast Asia were deployed by colonial and post-colonial regimes to make claims about the territories and peoples they ruled over. And following our conversation, we invite you all to join us right outside the museum in the Schaefer Galleria for tea and snacks, including samosas. So we're very excited. And tea provided by the Republic of Tea, one of our co-sponsors here. So that's enough of me talking. I'm going to turn it over to Rina, Timur, and Lawrence. Thank you all.
Thanks, Kate, for that very generous introduction, and thanks everyone for coming. I had a softball question to start us off.
Lawrence, could you speak a little bit louder or
Yeah.
turn up your volume?
How about now? Better?
A little bit louder.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. This is good. This is good. Yeah.
I'll put on my teaching
Yeah.
voice. So at the conclusion of this interview that you did with Art Forum in 2011, to discuss your exhibition at the Musée Guimet, you noted, I'm a non-resident Indian living in New York. I think it is important to ask what this means. And I thought it was a really funny way to end the interview, but a great way to segue into our discussion. So I wanted to ask you, what does that mean? But specifically in the context of this exhibition, which really seems to be set up, which was really curated as a dialogue between different times and different places. What is your position in the diaspora? How does that inform the way that you engage in this dialogue with other places, other times?
Well, thank you for inviting me and having this moment to discuss everything I'm thinking about with my work. The question of your status in the world, and more importantly, how one enters into knowing a person, learning about the person, and creating a relationship of transparency in some way to confront who they are themselves, really being the objective of going to an exhibition and learning who and where the artist is from. So one of the ways in which we do that is to mark this position of locality, legitimate locality. And it's less so about the artist saying, I really feel like I'm from New Zealand. So the openness that we create in making references to how we are concretely fixed into a position of light, which is that I'm American by standards that I have American citizenship, and NRR, which NRI, the idea of a non-resident Indian is a little different from the way I would say perhaps other people identify themselves. The trajectory of going back to homeland, having solid connections that are loose, really takes a different tone of understanding diaspora. The Indian diaspora, as we were growing up, was always there. We didn't need the title diaspora. We knew people who had left at different points in history throughout the history that we understood through oral kind of sharing between our parents. And this oral sharing became even more relevant as my parents saw differences in the way passport and policy, immigration policies changed. So when I reference myself in that kind of very awkward, cluttered way, I would say it's important that I'm suggesting this is the door that I will open wider, allowing maybe perhaps the idea of diaspora to be explored in ways that allow people who are from other cultural spaces to understand their intimacy with diaspora as opposed to their residence, New York being one of them. And I think for some people, and for the majority of people in 2011, as you were pointing to, it really was at times then, more so now, I think, where people related to where they were born, perhaps where they lived, where they ethnically found their homeland to be, and then never really thinking about the possibilities of where you're going in the future, and what is this kind of path or journey that you cross, how does it relate to who you are, and how does it not say anything? So when you have an exhibition like the Gay Men Museum, the museum itself has a unique identity in the sense that it's not like the Whitney Museum of American Art or the Centre Pompidou. It's not like the Picasso Museum. And so I'm also trying to reach, because this is an unusual framework in order to see contemporary art. This is a museum that gathered the artifacts from all over the world, specifically in the wardrobe it was creating for Asia. And I use the word wardrobe to suggest this is how we dress Asia. And that's important. And even the identity of this is my citizenship, this is my residence, is a kind of dressing up that we do in the museum to create the space to talk about almost everything.
So, hi. Is that working? Yes. As somebody who comes from a geography department, it's always so exciting, and for my student, I've got a couple students who are here. And one of the ways that I sort of start to explain human geography is that where we're from shapes who we are. But that immediately raises the question of origins. That there's one way of thinking about location and locality that sort of links identity to a very fixed, closed sense of self. But what I find really interesting about it, and here I'm also thinking the geographer Dorian Massey, who says the uniqueness of place comes not from the sort of internal, pure essence, but instead precisely the relations that connect that place, that locality elsewhere. And so it's one of the things that kind of in walking through the galleries that seems to really kind of be realized in a really wonderful way in your work. So is that a fair way of kind of thinking about how your sense of locality is sort of outward looking, in that it's always kind of thinking about these connections that dress us or can create geographies through these sort of outward looking connections?
Well, I think it's important to realize that as an artist growing up in the U.S., specifically in the New York City area, to have an identity that is not accepted requires you to really dismantle the idea of identity being fixed, and also to dismantle other people's identity as being a location. And so you're really talking about dislocating yourself from the identity that you're asked to wear, whether it be the kind of wearing of identity by the local culture or your family or your neighborhood and so on. So these kinds of ways in which to see yourself become a place to really talk about where identity kind of is leaky and becomes hard to contain. And I think museums like the Guimet, or all museums, as you may not recall, as many people who don't now, the Whitney Museum, as we refer to it in New York, was called the American Museum. And that title, the American Museum, was dropped. And it was dropped specifically in that era, 2010, where we started to reinvent ourselves as Americans as part of a global connection. We began to see an international market through the art fairs and biennials, and we began to reach out to understand that even the American identity that was specified at the time was now no longer useful. And it was not useful out of charity or altruistic, benevolent ideas, but it was useful because the economic shift away from New York City was real. Europe, in its contemporary museums and its gallery system, was rising in popularity and in investment. So when you look at the auction houses and they have a kind of breakdown of the economic pie, who is buying art, who is buying contemporary art, you have a shift into East Asia, particularly China and Korea. And that shift is the reason why the U.S. has decided to drop this idea of a narrow location of who is an artist, what is contemporary art, to participate with the rest of the world, which had a lot of pull. And so I think that's what's not talked about in our art classes, that this other world exists that we've ignored for so long. And during that time, because I was participating in biennials in 2006 in Japan, I was beginning to see the Japanese galleries, which harbored white artists and East Asian artists as representing contemporary art, were beginning to think of Asians from other parts of the world that were not East Asian. They were thinking about the Middle East. They were thinking about other Europeans that were not Northern Europeans. So this kind of dismantling of what is art is beginning to take hold, and it's beginning to pleasure in what it means to be human. What is human culture? And what can pass, therefore, as my culture, although the culture is seeded or had growth in different gardens in the world.
This is wonderful. It segues perfectly into another question that I have for you. So listening to you talk about making and remaking not just identity but also objects, you know, I think of your work very much as participating in a project of world making or world recovering or world remaking. And I'm using, you know, maybe to sketch out a brief kind of history of the term world making. So Hannah Arendt uses the term world making in the mid-20th century to refer to philosophy not just as a kind of intellectual project, but as a social project, a project that's engaged in real world preoccupations. And then more recently, scholars like Ariela Aisha Azule have used the term world making to reframe an understanding of pre-colonial creative practices as social practices and not just art. And she uses the example of the Benin bronzes as an example of in situ, at their origin, at their conception, these were not made as art objects, right, that were part of much more socially integrated practices, right, and rituals. But once they were extracted, removed, and placed in European institutions like the British Museum, they become art. And I guess what I'm wondering is maybe generally what does the term do for you? Because in your work I note this ambivalence towards the object, but you're still, I think of your practice as still very object-based. So I'm wondering how you see the work of world making within an art market that is predicated on these colonial practices of extraction and collection, right? And I think you've kind of hinted at this in some of the responses you just gave, right?
Sure.
That you're extremely conscious of the way that the market operates.
Yes, the market does operate, and we have to choose. We have to choose not only wisely, but with some level of awareness that we participate in this exchange. The market is just a place of exchange. It has its own method. And then we have to participate in a way that allows us to speak of who we are and what we love and how we go about securing what we love in a way, placing it back in the market with a different carrier. And I think that, the inclusion factor is not so much about generosity to really give a place to how the market operates. It really is about including yourself in that market. If you're excluded from the market, how does one include yourself? And I think that where we try to reach is to understand, is it possible today to make art that doesn't have a value to it? So much of our own system, currency, issues value to a dollar amount. And the museums are also engaged in this, but they do in some way, as academia is outside of the commercial art market, have kind of tendrils out there. They are affected and influenced by all those things that are outside of itself. And I think that students, the educational systems that we have shared with our students doesn't give us an awareness of that. And studying the colonial environment in which art became specified as a commodity that has to travel or were kind of hoarded, as in the Guinea Museum. And many Asian museums were really kind of like an Asia society of elite society people that both explored as if they were explorers but not explorers, and intellectuals, even though they were not intellectuals, took on many hats to produce what the museum is today. And I think the things that we bring into our home, those objects, have a very big impact on us, more than we think. And it's kind of a way, a conduit by which we think about our own identity, but also what we value. To have art that sends a kind of entryway to take value in things that never had value before has great influence. And so you as makers, as artists in school, have to consider what is being left out and why, and what is being considered, and considered with frequency and with a kind of domination that we encountered during the colonial period. These kinds of amazing archives of what is the best architecture in the world, what deserves a second glance, what it passes as our heritage, world heritage, as in the Taj Mahal, what are the seven wonders of the world, what shouldn't we think about, and who decides in effect. And I think when we consider these options, we have great freedom to really roam in places where we have not gone.
So kind of talking about markets makes me, I mean, one of the themes I'm hearing is that markets give us a sort of both the categories of value and a sort of a hierarchy. Within markets, there's a certain kind of hierarchy, and there's also sort of the geography of that. But this also makes me think, someone else whose work I went to and kind of thinking like this is the filmmaker Agnes Varda, who, in the film that comes to mind is The Gleaner's and I. And so thinking about how her interest in gleaning and sort of the objects that emerge into the margins. And so wondering if that also seems to be something sort of at stake in your practice, is kind of thinking about finding those objects that sort of exist at the edge of the categories of the market, and both bringing them into the market, but also sort of like reminding us of the limits and of the kinds of, reminds of the fictitious nature of the market in the first place.
I just want to piggyback on Timur's question, because I was thinking about the ways that, in many ways you're almost recovering certain objects from the market and dethroning or, twisting like their value. And I think there's one particular store that you work with a lot, right? And that made me think of knob carry and the work that Sarah Penn was doing in New York City in the 70s, 80s. So Sarah Penn was an African-American woman artist who had this store where she imported a lot of, curios from West Africa, East Africa, South and Southeast Asia. And she was, the shop was patronized by like almost every kind of important figure in African-American art. And so they often incorporated those curios into their own work or derived some kind of inspiration from that. But I thought that, this idea of like you're tapping into the market, right? But you're not, it's not determining what you're doing with the objects. It seems to be really interesting.
Yeah, I think you were referring to perhaps this kind of warehouse I go to, which is now in the basement, but it's owned by two very ambitious Orthodox Jewish men who traveled to West Africa at one point, and he was more of a developer of real estate, kind of weaned his fortunes from that aspect of his earnings. And when he came back, because he told the brothers who owned the store, came back, he told me of his story and how he went through some of the towns in West Africa and saw these artifacts, and they moved him so much that he invested in bringing back the people who carved them and also to bring back the objects. And they were objects that were not only from West Africa, but they were from different colonies. And they were sometimes from the Philippines, from Hawaii, and from Asia, from India, China. And he brought these things back for use. And that's what he remembered most, that they were being used, not just put on a pedestal. And this kind of spirituality that he also experienced in his travel became part of my reasons to go to the store, to talk to the brothers. And the people who worked in the store were not, as my mother would put it, not my kind of Indian. They were Caribbean Indian. And they were pretty standoffish in the beginning about my interest. And it took, I would say, 15 years of trust building to get them to be engaged with me. So maybe 3 people who worked in the store they often would point me to this direction or that direction, you should use this. Or there's a collaboration that takes place when you enter the world, whether it's the market or not. It isn't the original seed of genius that creates something that moves yourself or others who you share with, but this kind of intimacy that you create out of prolonged trust. And that is the point of departure from where you began to where you will become something that you're choosing your own making. And I think that's how I come to understand what my work is about. That adventure is very important to me. And so I think the most important aspect of learning about history through people, everyday people, is to know their personal experience of transformation, for example, what moves them still. And also to create a kind of attraction for the object. Attraction is rarely only, or it's often not at all about the material quality, whether it's made of gold, silver, or wood, or marble, in the case of the pintage. Attraction is about a kind of presence of an idea that seems to seep in to yourself, to your own other ideas, and they become different things for different people and different means of obtaining who you are. And I think that even, this kind of setting of the Hudson Valley, I'm in upstate New York quite often, and it has the same kind of spirituality and intimacy and distance at the same time as, some of the artifacts next to Viola in this room, to send you to a place where you have been but never really been there.
It makes me also, another theme as we're kind of talking through is the theme of exile and sort of, and again, I'm here, so Edward Said kind of has a phrase that runs through his work where he references the idea that the person for whom his homeland is sweet is a sort of beginner. And the more developed person is one to whom all countries are as their own. But the sort of the ideal that Said kind of holds up is the person to whom all lands are as a foreign land. And it's that position of kind of both locality and location, but also this kind of distance or sort of simultaneously mediated and unmediated experience of that place. And so I don't know if exile is the right word, but is there that sense of sort of foreignness or sort of estrangement, or is that sort of part of the process or part of the practice?
Well, I think the word foreign is very important, whether it refers to people or places. I think when I think of the word foreign, rarely do I think about the people. I often think about a place being foreign. And I always think of the people as the people. And the people are who make you feel at home in a place that is foreign. And your visit to a faraway place, that's what you reach for, And the market, where do I get milk? And where can I have my tea? And where can I get food? And how do I get on the train? And there's a kind of distancing of the place in order to feel at home with the place. That requires you to have the experience that you would with only people. And I think that's where that I seem to fall into, that I don't think being foreign can really exist. That it exists in the way we've marked out places in the world as mine and yours. Real estates. Real estate depends on the idea of foreign, and it depends on trespassing. as do passports. And those things create or fabricate the idea of foreignness as a commodity that can stipulate where other commodities have value and where they don't. Where trespassing creates a value for this chair, the stool, to be a certain amount here. But should you have the facility, the privilege, the access to bring it over here, you can have a higher value. So then does the chair have more value because it's a foreign chair? And how many of those foreign chairs does it take for it to become no longer foreign? So we talk about like these ideas in art. You know, we do talk about with a gallery, should I make 20 works this year? Or is it smarter to make 5? You know, your capacity, your ability. So all these things really get worked out. I mean, I think there is a kind of legendary idea of the artist being kind of naive and lost in kind of, I don't know, some emotional terrain that needs to be excavated and discovered by the society to bring it to value. That someone who's the middleman did some work that unburied the artist. So we have all these legendary ways of creating foreignness for the artist, you know. And so it's important to think of how that allows us to commodify art when we're thinking about the artist is from China, or the artist is from Turkey, or the artist is from India, and the artist is American. We never specify the artist is German when they're American. We never specify the artist is Irish when they are American. And so those kinds of things that appear subtle are not at all subtle in the market. And so the market is very useful in discovering a kind of post-colonial view of high capitalism that escaped colonialism into a new form of colonialism, I would say. So these are subjects I hope we all engage with and shape.
So interesting, you know, I think also, you know, so yes, the history of colonialism, you know, is about, you know, stems from the history of enclosing public space, which, you know, relates to like this idea of gleaning, right, that things that were once held in common now have a kind of like private, you know, have a private meaning. They can be owned privately. They're objects. They're things. And I think, you know, you can also maybe extend that same kind of, you know, that same kind of historical process to the project of humanism, right? That colonialism has, you know, has had this very long history of, you know, moving the line of what is human and what is not human, right? That human appears to be this extremely static category, right? Like we all can think of ourselves today as humans, but in fact, historically, it's been a very mutable category. One of the things that I see in your work, and particularly Rafael, is you know, the kind of reintroduction of this idea of the chimera, right? That we are not just static objects, right? But that we are composites. We are the composite of like, you know, all of these kind of like complex trajectories that come out of something like diaspora, right? That one is never just Indian or never just American, you know, or never even just Indian American, right? But that all of the kind of complex trajectories that are of our lives have like made us into these other things, right?
Yeah, I think that the composite idea is very important. I think the kind of essentialist way of seeking out your past is fraught with problematic that don't allow you to really adventure, to find who you are as an individual. exotic. In some sense, when they come together, and in another way, when they part ways. To authenticate yourself when you are considered exotic is the most difficult terrain, the most slippery place, where it's inevitable that it's fraught with the idea that you're an imposter. And so I think this is a very important thing to think about when realizing what kind of vehicle the word diaspora brings to us. How does it operate to disclose ideas of authenticity, and how the exotic is somewhat a kind of place to put what is not talked about, what can't be talked about. And can't be talked about because it is itself resisting to be known, the unknowable. And I think, if you are interested in the past and all those things that are hidden, there's a certain element of tourism that I partake in when in being interested in what happened in New Orleans, in this case, in the 1800s. And I did another project which was in Kansas City, which was similar in that sense. I was drawn to I love the New York Public Library, and I hope it lives on. And so you go to these towns, and there's a fabulous building that looks like it's armored in the most precious stones, and it's a library. It's not the bank, it's not the post office, it's a library. And the archives that are there are embedded with stories of immigrants in Kansas City. I was really interested in the children, immigrants from Poland and Southern Europe that came to make sausages out of the meat that was the main industry in Kansas City. And the poverty created out of their experience, the meatpacking industry that was in Kansas City, and how to use this to kind of represent a buried history, a shameful history, a history that is fraught with kind of creative ways to allow education to take place. And I think that in that situation, as in New Orleans, there is a kind of, of course, there is a kind of familiarity. I love sausages. So I'm drawn to these pictures. How is it made? How did they make it then versus now? The functional things. But also to imagine myself when I came in 1970 as a 7-year-old. Imagine being put to work in the factory where you didn't see your family for so many hours, that you were locked in a room, that it was cold, and you had the barest clothing. And there was this beautiful picture of these boys who showed off their unusual sausages. And they were of animals, and the intestines were recreated to make these sculptures that hung off of these pipes. And I think the playfulness and the kind of joy that one of the boys won the contest as the most interesting sausage was somehow inserted into the history books. And in some sense, I felt like an outsider, someone trespassing, that why should I be interested in this? To legitimize yourself as having true interest is to create a sense of attachment to the rest of the world that does not look like you. It's not your age. No longer. We've all been children at some point, but we all have not been in the other person's body, so to speak. And so these things are so vital in exercising through the art that trespasses can be validated through the historical kind of information information that is just waiting for you to recognize. And that's one of the joys of kind of jumping into another person's shoe, is to see how many different shoes you can wear.
And again, sort of hearing this theme that we're, I think, coming back to again and again in the conversation, this idea of trespass, the idea of crossing categories, moving in and out of the market, kind of all that capacity. And I mean, I wonder, going back to the question that the exhibit starts with, can we rescue love? And so what are the grounds, what are the possible grounds for rescue? Because one way to think about rescue is that someone falls overboard, there's a crisis, and we rescue them and restore them to an original order. And so that's one way to think about rescuing, is that we're somehow restoring an original thing. But I don't think that's how you think about rescue in your work. That there's something, so I guess I'm curious, like, what are the grounds for rescuing in your work?
Yeah, the word rescue is kind of uncomfortable word because it suggests a kind of sign of your heroicness. And there is a kind of heroicness to wanting to be human, for sure. It seems like a tall order. All the things we deem very human that we take pride in, and we do find ourselves stretching our ideas of love when we come across people who are not doing human things that we don't. We reject the demonstration of the other spectrum of activities that human beings take part in that are kind of dark and evil, So I think that rescuing has a sense of valor and courage, but it can go to the extreme of desiring power, and desiring power to maybe excavate in yourself something lost or damaged. A lot of fantasies of being Superman and fantasies of doing something great where everyone in your town will love you. Maybe it's finding the lost cat, but maybe it's something larger. And so these kinds of fantasies allows us to feel that we have the ability to rescue. But it's really also very selfish in the sense that it elevates and makes visible ourselves when we're not visible in the world. And I'm drawn to thinking about, in this way, about people who commit awful, atrocious kind of criminal acts in order to get attention. They are, in some sense, in their own mind, a kind of hero, a kind of hyper-visibility that consumes their desire. And their desire is not so much for the act itself, about how they will be perceived in some strange, inverted kind of appreciation or awe at what they've done. It's so reprehensible that people are taken aback, that that person feels a kind of aura around them. This is the other side of being a hero. And so there are plenty of people in history that we can mark as kind of evildoers, and evil things that happen in war. And I think that when we think about how history or our own definitions of what passes as good and bad reflect on how we will escape away from being planted as something that is nebulous in any way, we have to be really careful to be the hero that everyone wants. And so you're really talking about what is culture, what is deemed as worthy of rescue, who is not worthy of rescue, who does the rescuer, who they identify with, and even in places like this landscape, I think of how this kind of godly place, upstate New York, needs rescue. You know, the colonial landscape of other places and Americas.
And also just thinking about the image behind us and that question of rescue there and the kinds of hands emerging out of the water. Yeah, was.
No, I was hoping to continue, on this line of inquiry and maybe draw you out a bit more on these ideas of love, heroism, and rescue, but project them onto the work itself. And I was thinking of Take Me to the Palace of Love, I guess, which is maybe, to venture a kind of architectural metaphor or analogy. I think heroism in architecture is like, can be understood as a kind of, as a certain approach to monumentalism, right? That things are heroic in architecture when they are monumental. Why is it doing that? Yeah, maybe I'll lower it. And I was thinking of the history of the Taj, and the kind of the ways that this very complex history of the Taj has really been sort of overlaid with a really kind of trite, tourist brochure understanding of the monument as a monument to love. And that at the same time that it's a monument to love, it's also a monument to death, right? That it also houses a cenotaph and then a real tomb underneath the cenotaph. After the building, after the Taj is built, during the 1857 rebellion, or during the suppression of the 1857 rebellion, British troops loot the Taj and remove all of the kind of precious stones from the facade of the building, and then Lord Curzon comes back and wants to restore the Taj, to recover the Taj. But what he does is to completely remake it, right? In this fantasy of what, almost this like Arabian Nights fantasy of what South Asia is. And so I guess I was just curious, for you, when you call this piece "Take Me to the Palace of Love," what is the kind of love that the Taj conjures? How does it depart from a romantic love? Does it gesture towards a concept of love that is not burdened by either biological time or anthropomorphism? Is it love or melancholia?
Yeah, I certainly think that most people, when they think of the color pink, think of probably love, and definitely a celebration of something honored. And with the pink Taj and its legend of romance, I took to this title because it referenced an old vintage Hollywood movie in black and white that I saw snippets of. And in it, the woman was down on her knees in hopes that this man would rescue her, take her, take her, take her. So she says, "Take me to the Palace of Love." And so in my reading as a teenager, I would say, I didn't think of it as a love that was about romance at all, but rather the kind of desperation she exhibited and his power, standing man in beautiful, maybe silk clothes of white. She needed to be rescued, as we talked about. And love is a place where people can be rescued in the way we imagine it today. And in some sense, it rescues you from the world. It rescues you from the limits of your mortality. It rescues you from the darkness of the world. It rescues you into light. So this piece was made with this kind of essence of love and the desperation, which is "take me," said 3 times. is the impossibility of love also. There's this kind of dark cloud that projects onto the world of impossibility. And I think this is where it really comes to me to suggest how justice prevails in our minds, in our fantasy. That no matter what, even in the end of everything, justice, like love, must prevail. And I think in making the pink Taj kind of never valuable because it's made of plastic, I suppose, but also has a kind of rosy appearance, you know, and it's both rosy and tender because it's rosy, but also with the skin-like quality of the material and its kind of pinkness references kind of the unveiling of the body without skin. That's kind of a grotesque reading. And the interior with its valuable antique chairs, that was very much, you know, Blackwood, Bombay Blackwood commodity between, you know, mercantile people of the 1800s in the US and India, in Cape Town, possibly in England, was very much a kind of coveted furniture that the wealthy had. And I think that to put that in the center core as its guts, and the bubbling of what I think of the vegetable and floral quality of the chandelier, constellation of bubbles and balls and maybe planets that trickle onto a vintage semi-precious stone globe where the sea is black, creates a kind of worthy sense of danger about love, which is also the legend of love. You will be hurt if you seek this out. You will find yourself lost in sea. And you will have to come back from that journey with the love you want in your pockets, in your arms. And so it creates a kind of tremendous sense of adventure, but desire for something that you don't yet have. And when I think of, you know, recreating the Taj back then, after its looting, I can't imagine the kind of desire to have it, the object, the architecture, be loved by the newcomers, the new people who felt they owned the Taj, they owned India, and maybe soon they will own the world, and they're going to show the prettiest things they've found, and they're going to make it better. And so there is a sense of occupation and conquest that is created out of these seven wonders. That pillaging, looting is not very far from the museum ambition. And so we always have to think about what all those things mean.
Keeping one eye on time. Do you have one more?
I have one last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe just to follow up, you know, Romita pointed out earlier the kind of speaking of dialogues, the kind of dialogue and scale that's happening between Take Me to the Palace of Love and the guidebooks to the actual Taj that she found in the stacks at Bird Library. And I just wonder, for me, there's also a kind of, there's a latent critique of like the very idea of the monument in the work itself, right? Benjamin says there's no monument to civilization that is also not a monument to barbarism. And I guess what I'm curious about is what is the scale that you were going for? Why is the Taj reproduced at this particular scale for you? What does that do to your understanding of the Taj as a monument to love?
Well, I think the scale of anything is always a referential, and it's about juxtapositions that create a sense of imbalance for the viewer. We're not really changing in scale. So it's a reference to your body, what it can manage and what it reads into it. It's just big enough to be a very playful gazebo. And yet it alludes to kind of this grand, fantastic ambition of reproduction, which it doesn't want to even succeed in obvious ways. And it's made to float, which creates a sense of imbalance as well, because when you walk around it, and if enough people walk through it, and with its one kind of position of attachment, it has a sense of wanting to spin, or there's a flutter of movement that I think many of us has probably experienced when they're trying to not move, and they're around something that moves ever so subtly that it creates a poor sense of being balanced, destabilizing. So that's part of the kind of reproduction of it. The reproduction has no interest in reproducing the Taj Mahal, and it has no interest in being monumental. And yet the scale of it is large enough where we think of the monumental, because this is on the verge of monumental sculpture, perhaps. The scale of the armchair is so big that it has this kind of Alice in Wonderland feel of entry. And so even the balls that are entertained have a kind of temporal and also fragile aspect of being not serious. And at the time when I made these Taj, I made more than one. I made a green Taj in Japan, and I made a yellow Taj in London. And these Tajas, there was a kind of feeling by the public at the time that this could not be passed as contemporary art. So we're talking about like 2003, 2006, where there was a debate and a fight for me as the artist to say, this is my art. No, this is not. This is just a temporary sculpture. We're going to break it down. We're going to throw it out. It's going to be out in the garbage. And then that's the museum world. And then the kind of market world, its eagerness to sell. I got to buy it for you. I got to buy it for you. I got a place we want to show it in 5 different places. So not only the buying of it, but desiring to see it. The theater of an exhibition creates a kind of imbalance between these two markets, if we can go back to the commercial market versus the academic market versus, the gallery market, which is different, the museum world, and so on. So one of these Taj, the green Taj, did get thrown out, even though there was a buyer for it. That created a contradiction. And then the other one is still alive and is in London. And then this one, the pink one. And then I've done lots of domes, which is the echoing format of some of my sculptures, and even viola, and obviously in this one where the dome is upside down, Lost World, and doing these kinds of things where there's an echo but it's not obvious, it's a lot of fun, not just to see that it's possible to have a kind of stretch in vocabulary, that you can be acrobatic in ways that maybe other people cannot realize, but you somehow clumsily fell upon. My Lost World, the dome was made upside down because I had read that in medieval times in northern Europe, there was a kind of madness in villages because they had been enclosed in famine, and out of hunger, they started to drink and have party and merriment. And there is a and psychology, whether lack of food can make you joyous to an upsetting level. And so this idea was really implanted in me as a way of talking about the madness of creating the visibility and the accessibility of the world, even the accessibility of what's inside the world, what's inside the earth, to mine it, to create a commodity and a capitalism that is fruited out of colonialism, and then to distinguish it out of war between places where one place covets what the other place has, and then to distinguish the whole earth as we know it, is this kind of world loss that I'm referring to. So I think that scale is not only about what you see in terms of how big or small in measurement sculpture is, but it's the scale of your mind, what it can encompass in one piece as an idea, what you can pull out of it that is larger, that can contain all the ideas in the world that we've ever had in a single piece. I find that a more challenging and acrobatic as an artist. How can I tell the story of what I've seen in the world?
And that might be actually a really wonderful observation to finish our conversation with today. So, Rina, thank you so much for being in conversation with us today. Thank you so much to everybody for being here.
Thank you.
We have tea and samosas.
Yeah, so we'd love everyone to continue the conversation.
Maybe questions? Does anyone have questions?
Yeah, but we're-
Maybe one question we can take and then move out for tea and samosas, whichever I mean, which have been guarded for Surya.
What has been the response of diasporic communities to your work?
By people or
People, particularly South Asian diaspora.
Well, I think in the beginning it was really so impossible to take. I remember having a conversation with the curator, Anne, I won't say her last name. And we were at a little pub in Soho. She was furious with me. And it was the year 2000, and she's been a big supporter of mine. And she was furious with her friend who was also a curator. And they were furious because they were Jewish and they believed that the word diaspora should not be used unless it's used in conjunction with the Jewish people or the Jewish experience. So it's come a long way since then, and obviously people use it in all kinds of ways, and it creates all kinds of despair and darkness as well as light and restrictions still, because every word we plant in your brain has more possibilities. I think words are a valuable way to learn why we need to always expand our vocabulary, but not only our vocabulary, but the way we use the word is very important to be sensitive to, and that it's something that different people will always use differently to suggest what their experience is. And there's always a failing in the word to describe who you are, and that's what makes us very human. That we have very high standards of our ideas of completeness that the languages we use cannot really hold, and therefore we go to the visual and we go for the experiential to revert to.
Thank you.
I think we should continue the conversation over some refreshments. We have tea, we have samosas, we have cookies right in the gallery. So thank you all so much for your
Thank
generosity.
you. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you. And Emily, where are you? There you are. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful time to talk to both of you as well.
And the conversation can continue.
Yes, the samosas are piping hot.